Bicyclists and a member of the Advocacy Advanced team. We're going to give it another minute or two here and then get started on this webinar, which is all about how federal transit funds improve access to transit for people who bike and walk. So just hold tight and we'll start in earnest in another minute. Great. All right. So hi everyone, this is Ken again. This is our webinar, First Mile, Last Mile, How Federal Transit Funds Improve Access to Transit for People Who Walk and Bike. This is a webinar by Advocacy Advance. Advocacy Advance is a partnership between the Alliance for Biking and Walking and the League of American Bicyclists. We receive funding for the SRAM Cycling Fund and the Everybody Walk Collaborative, two great organizations that support getting more people to bike and walk. We have a great list of speakers today. We have Joanne Waszczak from Federal Transit Administration, Chris Leinberger from the president of LOCUS, which is part of Smart Growth America, and is a network of real estate developers and investors interested in sustainable, walkable urban development. And we have Jason Ward from the Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. Our key goals today are to better understand FTA funding programs and past FTA funding of biking and walking projects, to understand the FTA and FHWA policies that make funding transit-related biking and walking projects easier, and learn about transit-oriented development that encourages walking and biking. We released a report that you should have received before this webinar, and you can find on our website and at that link, that summarizes some of the things that we've found and talks about these goals. So the first part is who is walking and biking transit, give some background on the current state of integration of walking and biking in transit. There's a big push to give more people options and choices in how they get around rather than just getting around by cars. And APTA has found that 70% of millennials use more than one transportation option to get to a destination a few times a week or more, and they found that public transportation is one of the best ways to enable those multimodal trips. AARP did a survey of older households and found that 71% of those households want to live within walking distance of transit. So people really value multimodalism and the ability to get around in multiple ways and find that transit is an integral part of those multimodal solutions. Walking to transit is very prevalent nationwide. 60% of transit users either walk to transit or walk away from transit when they exit their trips. This chart is from a recent WMATA study in Washington, D.C. that shows that in areas with more households and a half-mile walkshed of transit stations, more people walk to transit. So when people are able to walk to transit, they do. And this report is about helping enable those connections. Biking to transit has increased since 2001. It's become more common across all transit types, especially in commuter rail. And as background, nationally since 2000, the number of people who bike to work has increased to 786,000 people approximately, and it was the fastest growing mode of all commuting modes tracked by the Census Bureau. So this data about people accessing transit by biking is mirrored in general in terms of the increase of people biking to work. And biking and walking to transit give a lot of benefits to the communities, especially through physical activity. Public transit users take 30% more steps per day than people who rely on cars, and people are far more likely to walk to destinations when it's a mile or less. And you'll see that in some of the FTA guidance that we'll talk about later in this report. And in general, more physical activity is better for our health. Lower body weights, less air pollution, and fewer cars on the road that might cause collisions. So now I'll quickly go over some of the things we discussed in our report, but please check out our report to learn more about these topics. There's a lot of facilities that help people access transit by bikes. So you can have rail with trails, and you can have bike lanes on roads, and you can have separated bike lanes within the same right-of-way. We see those 3 facilities here. Bicycle facilities can also do a lot to mitigate potential conflicts between transit vehicles and bicyclists within the same right-of-way. As you can see in that top left picture, there's the striped bike lane that goes through that conflict zone where the bus pulls out of the main road. And having that can make people feel a lot safer and feel like there's more convenient connections to transit when they're biking. Bicycle facilities at transit has a lot of great data through APTA surveys. This data is not national, but it is from the people from the transit agencies that respond to these surveys. So in the last decade, you can really see dramatic growth in bike parking at bus stops and rail stops, and the percentage of buses with external bike racks. The Alliance for Biking and Walking also has a great benchmarking report that has a lot of data on public transit agency accommodations, particularly external bike racks, where most cities are providing those facilities. Pedestrian facilities, there is less information about, less data about, but we know that it's incredibly important to provide pedestrian facilities so that people can access transit stations, and those half-mile walk shed around transit stations are really walkable and places where people can feel safe and comfortable as they're accessing those transit amenities. And really, land use and development can have a profound impact in this area. So our 2 speakers, Jason and Chris, who will talk about transit-oriented development later, that is extremely important for creating a proper pedestrian environment for access to transit. In the past, this is the Urbanized Area Formula Grant spending, which is one FTA program that can pay for pedestrian and bicyclist amenities. 26% of it between 2000 and 2012, 26% of transit enhancement spending was directly for bicycle and pedestrian access facilities and equipment. In this program, FTA agencies are required to spend 1% on these types of facilities, but over this time period, they actually chose to spend 1.5%, showing the popularity of these types of amenities. Bike share has been a huge success in the cities that it's rolled out in, and both FHWA and FTA can pay for capital costs associated with bike share systems. However, FTA cannot pay for the bikes themselves, so FHWA or local funds are the ways to pay for the bikes themselves. The Pedestrian and Bicyclist Information Center has a great report from last year called Bike Sharing in the United States that has a lot of information about how various systems have been funded in the past. So we would direct you there. And a really exciting thing that has happened in terms of FTA guidance is for their New Starts and Small Starts program, which pays for increased capacity or improvements in corridors for certain types of transit amenities, particularly light and heavy rail and bus rapid transit. These projects can now include bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and it won't be counted against them when they do their benefit cost equation. So when localities want to include these type of amenities, it doesn't hurt them in getting these funds, and that's really exciting so people can plan for biking and walking and not have it count against them. We're also really excited about the advocacy campaigns that have happened to increase biking and walking integration with transit. Many bicycling and walking advocates have realized that local ballot measures that improve transportation options for all, particularly transit options, are great places to get involved and to include biking and walking amenities at the same time. So in Bike Walk Kansas City, there was a major streetcar development, and they used that development to ensure that those corridors were bicycle and pedestrian friendly. In Bike East Bay, they worked with a broad coalition on a ballot measure that will bring a transformative amount of money to both transit and biking in the Bay Area. Bike East Bay and the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition have been working with BART since 1970s to get bicycle access all hours, and this last year they were able to do so. And the Active Transportation Alliance, which is a big bicycle and walking advocacy group in Chicago, actually made transit advocacy part of their mission and has recently been looking into some big transformative investments that can be made in the Chicago area. So please check out our report to learn more about these exciting ways that people are bringing together biking, walking, and transit. I think our panelists will give a great amount of information on this. And Jason Ward from Marta will speak, but also I want to thank Amy Goodwin from the Atlanta Regional Commission, who really contributed to this report and will be available for questions later. So with that, I'll hand this over to Joanne Waszczak from FTA.
Hi, everybody. This is Joanne, and I just want to say thanks for inviting me to talk today about wheeling and walking to transit. It's one of my favorite topics because it brings together social justice, community planning, active transportation, and public policy.
Send it to her, not you.
So I've been walking and wheeling to transit since college, first in Sonoma County in California. So I was in the Bay Area, then in Copenhagen because I was there on a year abroad, and later in Southeast Michigan during grad school, and now in Metro DC. And I just noticed that in some of these cities it's easy to bring your bike on the train, while in other cities it's hard to just catch a bus. Actually, it was young people who I worked with in Metro Detroit who got me interested in transit, because they identified the lack of reliable transit as one of the top policy issues for young people in Metro Detroit, especially for young people of color and low-income people. So over the past 7 years, I've worked in a bunch of different offices at FTA, from the administrator's office to our planning office, our civil rights office, and now in our office of budget and policy. And it's a great vantage point because I've been involved in equity and connectivity, and now in the Secretary's Bike Ped Safety Initiative. Next slide, please. You've probably heard the President and Secretary Anthony Foxx talking a lot about ladders of opportunity lately. And under Secretary Foxx's leadership, DOT is strengthening its focus on walking and biking as a ladders of opportunity effort. He's specifically focusing on bike ped safety and bike ped connectivity, including first and last mile solutions. And in a great coup earlier this year, he hired Barbara McCann, the Queen of Complete Streets, to come on board as our Director of Safety, Energy, and Environment. And she brings a lifetime of great work on bike ped with her, and knows that transit riders access their stops and stations in a variety of ways. And she wants to make sure that all these trips are safe and simple, which means that we need a tightly connected network of complete streets without gaps. Next slide, please. So today I just wanted to highlight some of our sustained and ongoing efforts that are related to transit, bike, and ped, and those include the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, the DOT policy on bike and ped, the FTA policy on bike and ped, and some existing funding opportunities that you can use for your bike ped infrastructure. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight some emerging efforts that are related to ladders of opportunity, to the Bike Ped Safety Initiative that I was just talking about, and to what we see as a new era in bike ped, ridership and infrastructure, because we're seeing the integration of a lot of bike ped infrastructure into transit projects. We mentioned earlier in this webinar the New Start criteria, and we're also seeing bike sharing and some other emerging trends. I also wanted to touch briefly on DOT-wide and government-wide efforts. And I wanted to actually ask you to keep your eye on the Secretary's blog called The Fast Lane and on DOT's and FTA's Twitter accounts, because in the next few months you're going to be seeing some really exciting news coming out from DOT and FTA about the Bike Ped Safety Initiative. Next slide, please. So you'll remember probably that prior to the birth of the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, FTA and HUD were actually working together to encourage communities to preserve and expand the supply of affordable housing that was in walking distance of transit. So at that time, we partnered with the Center for Transit-Oriented Development, and we created MITOD, or MITOD.org, which it stands for Mixed Income Transit-Oriented Development. And that website helps you to assess an existing real estate market, look at the development capacity of that market, and then build a box of policy and program tools that are tailored to your specific community. A lot of folks are trying to work on mixed income TOD, which I know we're going to talk about later in this webinar, because it does reduce the cost of transportation and housing by allowing people to walk and or bike to transit. And it improves the quality of life in communities, otherwise known as livability. So we are continuing our efforts in the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, and maybe some of you go to meetings with people in your region around the country and sit with folks from DOT, EPA, and HUD to work on livability issues, including bike ped. Next slide, please. Oh, one more. So the policy on bike ped accommodation came out quite a while ago. It's probably about 4 years old now, and this DOT policy encourages transportation agencies to go beyond minimum requirements and design standards. For a long time, I think that DOT was content with giving the minimum to bike ped, but that era is over. So now DOT is encouraging agencies to proactively provide convenient and safe and context-sensitive facilities that foster bike ped. We want to see people improving their non-motorized facilities, and we want to see people doing things like removing snow from sidewalks and other shared use bike ped paths. So if you want to learn more about the DOT policy on bike ped accommodation, you can find that on the DOT website. Next slide, please. Also, 3 or 4 years ago, right after the DOT policy came out, FTA came out with a policy on bike ped. And at that time, we were thinking about the fact that the success of transit is limited or constrained by the problem of first and last mile. We noticed that across the country, some of our best and brightest planners were working on streetcars and light rail systems and bus rapid transit lines, but we also wanted to make sure that we came out with a policy to encourage smart planners to also concentrate just as hard on getting people to stops and stations. So when we came out with this policy, we realized that bikes are one of the best options for solving the first and last mile dilemma. And we also were constrained by the fact that federal law only permits FTA to fund bike ped improvements that have a relationship to transit. So we wanted to simplify this process for you. And in 2011, we published a policy statement on the eligibility of pedestrian and bicycle improvements. In that document, we defined a catchment area of a ½ mile for pedestrian improvements and 3 miles for bicyclists. So what that means is that you can make bike improvements within 3 miles of a transit stop or station, pedestrian improvements within a ½ mile of a stop or station, as long as those improvements have a de facto functional relationship to public transportation. And I know those are, very procedural words. So again, if you want to learn more about the FTA catchment policy, please go ahead and look on our website. You'll find the full policy there. And we are hoping that this policy will continue to inspire people to put together well-designed bike ped amenities that keep the existing riders who are already riding their bikes and walking to transit, and also encourage new riders. Next slide, please. So this brings up the question of, well, what is a capital project? What does the law say? And so I wanted to make sure you understood that the definition of a capital project includes a public transportation improvement that includes pedestrian and bicycle access to a transit facility. So what that means is that you can think of this as access to a stop or station, parking at a stop or station, and storage on a transit vehicle. So on this slide, we give you some examples of what might be eligible. For example, planning for bike ped transit integration, sidewalks, multi-use paths, bike racks, bike lockers, bike hooks, bike racks. So, you know, be sure to take a look at this slide later. I think we are sharing these slides, and think more creatively about, you know, what it means to fund bike ped infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this is a really busy slide, and I just wanted to give you a feeling for the sheer number of FTA and FHWA grant programs that have bike ped planning or bike ped project implementation as an eligible expense. There's a lot more information available about FTA and FHWA funding on our website. You see one listed there at the bottom left. That one is a really handy chart that shows you the eligible costs for each program. And I'm sorry for the oversight on this slide. I realized that I forgot to turn the flex funds red in the FHWA column, so I'll update the slides to accurately reflect which funds can be flexed to FTA. For now, you can go visit that website that's at the bottom left and find out more about which FHWA funds can be flexed over to FTA to fund bike ped infrastructure. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the emerging effort. And again, this is a really exciting time to be at DOT and FTA because of the progressive stance, I would say, that we're taking toward bike ped. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit earlier about ladders of opportunity, and this is something that you've probably heard from the President, the Secretary, and all the different members of the President's Cabinet. As for our take on ladders of opportunity, Secretary Fox talks a lot about the fact that transit is a line of opportunity that goes from someone's house to their workplace, to their school, to their doctor, to their grocery store. And so we're thinking also about bike lanes and sidewalks and such as other lines of opportunity. And we want to make sure that we connect the lines so that there aren't gaps in them. Ladders of opportunity is probably at the top of the Secretary's list of priorities along with safety. And so he's really prioritizing transportation equity and social sustainability. I think in years past you've probably seen us emphasizing the environmental and economic sustainability legs on the sustainability stool. And now with Secretary Fox, you're going to see us emphasizing the social sustainability leg of that stool. He really wants to increase access and opportunity for all users. And so on the first slide of the presentation, you notice that that meant anyone who's wheeling or walking to a transit station, whether they're on foot, on a bike, in a wheelchair, in a stroller. He wants to make sure that all these users have access to transit and do not have physical or functional barriers between them and their transit station. You might want to check out the 2014 White House Champions of Change website, because on there you'll notice that he selected a couple of people who have done work related to bike ped and equity or environmental justice. Next slide, please. So this is really the meat of the bike ped safety initiative that the Secretary will be rolling out next month. And I just wanted you to understand sort of where he's coming from. Like I said on the last slide, the Bike Ped Safety Initiative is at the intersection of safety and ladders of opportunity. And the story behind this is that the Secretary was running in Charlotte. He got hit by a car while he was on a jog, and that really raised his awareness level about bike ped injuries and fatalities. So a lot of recent reports, including the League of American Bicyclists report about equity, are bearing out that we are seeing that folks are at greater risk of accidents and injuries if they are people of color who are walking and biking. And so I think that that's very meaningful to our secretary, and he's taking that very seriously and trying to figure out how to connect bike ped networks. Next slide, please. So we've seen some recent integration of bike ped infrastructure into some of our splashier transit projects like the Silver Line and Metro DC. There you see an enclosed secure bike parking structure for 200+ bikes, including oversized bikes and trailers. And they also have 2 fix-it stations there at the station. In Tucson, their streetcar has designated areas painted on the floor where you're supposed to stand with your bike. And in Central Florida, the Sunrail project has designated 6 spaces for bikes per passenger car, and also made sure to link bike ped trails directly to their stations. Next slide, please. We also heard earlier in the presentation a little bit about the New Starts and Small Starts program. We now call that our Capital Investment Grants Program, or CIG program. And this is a pretty complex program, so we wanted to make sure that you understood the ins and outs of it. The law requires FTA to evaluate and rate all potential CIG projects on 6 specific justification criteria, and one of them is cost effectiveness. So I would just say that we need to keep in mind that the project overall has to earn at least a medium rating to be eligible for funding. So even though cost effectiveness is a very important rating element in the New Starts process or the CIG process, it is just one element. We should look at what does cost effectiveness mean. So when we calculate cost effectiveness, we're looking at the annualized capital cost of a project plus the annual operations and maintenance budget divided by the annual number of estimated trips. And so that's what we're talking about when we say that we can reduce the FTA percentage of enrichment when we're looking at cost effectiveness. So the capital costs of the scope elements that are considered enrichments are either reduced by a defined percentage, or they could be eliminated entirely from the annualized capital cost calculation. Now, enrichments is a funny word. It's a new word for a lot of people because it used to be called transit enhancements. That was a completely different program, so we wanted to make sure not to use the word enhancements, and that's why we're using enrichment. Next slide, please. So an enrichment is an improvement to the transit project that's desired by the project sponsor, but FTA does not consider it integral to the planned functioning of the project, and the benefits aren't captured in whole by the criteria. An enrichment is an allowable expense for reimbursement under a future CIG construction grant. And one of the enrichments has to do with bike ped improvements, and it's the activity line item 40.06 in case you're really deep into this. And bike ped improvements are considered one type of enrichment that can be removed from the New Starts cost effectiveness calculation. In order to be removed, though, the bike ped improvements must be consistent with FTA's bike ped policy. So if you want to learn more about this, you can go to the standard cost category worksheet at the link that's provided on the screen, and it will talk to you about the types of bike ped improvements that are eligible for this, like sidewalks, furniture, bike facilities. And just know that through its project management oversight contractors, FTA verifies that these enrichments that are claimed by project sponsors are in fact eligible. Next slide, please. Earlier we heard about bike sharing, and we just wanted to emphasize here that bike share and transit are family. They support each other. For a while, I think people were a little afraid that bike share would take away from transit or transit would take away from bike share. And we're finding out in reports now that they do in fact support each other quite well. Bike share is a great first and last mile solution and often provides a good alternative to transit when there's a short trip or it's late night or weekends and there isn't rail service. or when there are service disruptions. So a lot of folks have been asking us questions about bike share. We have a good question and answer available about bike share at the link that's on the screen. And if you have additional questions about bike share, you can always contact us at FTA, and we'll do the best we can to help you with that. Next slide, please. Something that we've been noticing is group rides across the country in different cities. This is an emerging trend, and while it may not seem that relevant to transit, what we've been noticing is that these rides like the Detroit Slow Roll that pulls together about 3,000 people per week, and the DC and Baltimore bike parties that pull together around 1,000 people per week, these rides are very diverse in their participation. There are people of all ages, races, ethnicities, genders, skill levels joining in on these rides. And this is really broadening the cycling constituency and bringing equity to the forefront of the bike ped movement. So we think that these are probably going to be a good venue for people to become educated about bike ped issues, and it will probably build a really diverse cycling constituency that organizes for bike ped infrastructure. And you may be seeing that in your own city or location. Next slide, please. And on the walking front, we're seeing a lot of walk audits. That picture is of Dan Burden, who's the Johnny Appleseed of walk audits. And we're noticing that more and more communities are using walk audits as well as bike audits as a tool to evaluate infrastructure, to figure out how safe and accessible and comfortable and convenient is the walk and bike infrastructure in a specific area. These could be done at a neighborhood level, a corridor level, or even as small as a transit station or stop area. And they help to identify strengths and challenges as well as alternatives and solutions for bike ped infrastructure. You'll probably be hearing a lot more about these. We conducted 3 bike ped assessments recently, and that will be part of what the Secretary is talking about when he rolls out his bike ped safety initiative next month. Next slide, please. And just to close, I wanted to mention that folks all across DOT and the federal government are working on bike ped. You're going to hear a lot in the coming months from FHWA and from NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, about their bike ped safety initiatives. You also might want to learn about some joint technical assistance that came out from the Department of Transportation and the Department of Justice about curb ramps, and about the technical assistance that came out from the Access Board regarding public rights-of-way, because that technical assistance focuses on sidewalks and streets, including crosswalks and pedestrian signals, bike signals, etc. So be on the lookout for these bike ped tools and resources to be coming from lots of different places, not just from FTA, not just from DOT. And on my last slide, it just gives you some ideas about where to find additional information about the work that we're doing at DOT, and my email address in case you'd like to write to me and ask me any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. It's great to hear how much FTA and DOT are doing to encourage biking, walking to transit, and making sure that people can access those ladders of opportunity. And the report kind of goes into those eligibilities and those FTA funding programs and gives specific examples of projects that they've funded across a variety of facility types. And thank you for that presentation. We're now going to get a great presentation from Chris Leinberger, who's the president of LOCUS, which once again is a network of real estate developers and investors. So Chris, you're ready to go.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
Just want to double check. So I want to give you the perspective from a real estate developer perspective. LOCUS, part of Smart Growth America, is comprised of real estate developers from throughout the country. Jonathan Rose up in New York, JBG here in Washington, Forest City that works nationally, Federal Realty, Press Kabakov's firm down in New Orleans. And so we are actively engaged at the national level and in various states on trying to make walkable, urban, transit-oriented development the default mode for the future of our country. And we know that's the case because we think it's, from a market point of view, we know it's the future. There's great pent-up demand for walkable urbanism, and the reason that we know that is because of the huge price premiums for walkable urban development, i.e. gentrification. And that merely means that we don't have enough product that is walkable urban, that has driven up the prices, particularly land prices. So to me, and to all of us that are in this development world, this doesn't have, this isn't just walkable, but it's bikeable. Bikeability is the cheapest new form or expanded form of transportation we as a country can engage in. And we want to, increase it from the current, 1% mode split to what many European cities have that are, 10, 20, 25, even 30% mode shares. The issue is that much of the country right now continues to think in an old lens, an old way of how we're building the built environment. It's either urban or suburban. It's city or suburbs. Toss that. It no longer makes any sense. The new lens is whether a place is walkable urban, high density, mixed use. Once you're there, it's walkable. And you get there, if you have to get there, by car, transit, or biking. And walkable urban places can take place either in the center city or in the suburbs. And in fact, our research shows that the pent-up demand is most apparent in the urbanizing suburbs of this country. Here in Metro DC, 50% of all walkable urban development is now in the suburbs, in Arlington and Bethesda and Reston Town Center in Silver Spring. So it's no longer the old way of thinking city versus suburb. It is walkable urban versus drivable suburban. So the form that this takes is when you take a look at your metropolitan area, you have either walkable urban places or drivable suburban places. And you know what drivable suburban is: very low density, car dominated, bikes barely work, transit barely works, and basically the only way to get between point A and point B is by car. Then there's two economic functions of land use. One is regionally significant. This is where we make our living, whether it be edge cities or our downtowns and suburban downtowns, or local serving. Local serving places are bedroom communities. Well, our research is showing that over the next, and this is not in all metropolitan areas, but this is in selective metropolitan areas such as Boston and Washington and Chicago and Denver and Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, and more in places like, you'll hear in just 1 second, from metropolitan Atlanta, which has, the poster child of sprawl, has in this real estate cycle turned the corner on sprawl. So our research is showing that in these metro areas, 80% of future development is going to go to the walkable urban places. And as you see from this slide, that's less than 10% of the existing landmass. This is why we're going to see sprawl coming to an end in this country in selective metropolitan areas. Now, I'm not going to say that Houston and Dallas are about to stop sprawling, but in many metropolitan areas, that's where they're heading, into the walkable urban places. This is how it lays out on the ground in Metro DC. I'm going to show you 45 walkable urban places that are regionally significant. First, starting with downtown adjacent places around downtown, urban commercial, such as H Street and Columbia Heights, that are playing a regionally significant role in the metropolitan region. Then going out to the suburbs, the old suburban town centers that all declined back in the late 20th century, they are now almost all coming back in these in places like Bethesda and in Arlington and in Old Town Alexandria. Then here's the biggie: the conversion of strip commercial into walkable urban places. And the big monster that you see right smack in the middle, number 37, is Tyson's. Tyson's is going to convert into at least 3 walkable urban places. As you may know, a month ago, the Silver Line opened in Tyson's, and it was paid for about a third of the cost of that very expensive multi-billion-dollar extension was paid for by local real estate developers and owners. Keep that in mind, because it's going to be something you're going to be using in the future. And then finally, there's a few greenfield sites that are being developed, such as Reston Town Center. But for the most part, those are going to be in the minority because they're very expensive to do. The Chinese are doing a lot of these. We're not going to do too many of them. This is the metro lines in this community. 80% of the walkable urban places that are regionally significant are rail transit served. That's not a coincidence, but 20% are not rail transit served. So it's not impossible to do this kind of development if you do not have rail transit. One of the big things that we can see is in this country is a historic shift in how we get around. There's been a 100-year trend, a connection between gross domestic product and vehicle miles traveled. And many of you know that that connection that has been a one-to-one correlation for 100 years has recently changed. In the mid-90s, vehicle miles traveled, that curve began to change, was bent. And right now, in this country, we are past peak driving in absolute terms. It peaked in 2004. Young people driving peaked in 2001, and it's down on a per capita basis. Young people 16 through 34. In absolute terms, on a per capita basis, it's down by about 1/3 in annual driving. This is a historic shift. Much of that shift has been due to walkable urban development and the shift towards bikeability. So this is happening, and it's primarily because the knowledge economy requires fewer car and truck trips, but also the demographics are driving it. As young people say, I'd rather be in a walkable urban place. Now, how are we going to pay for this? This is where I'd like to close, because we have to pay for this stuff. And obviously the federal government has a role to play, but it's a minor role, because the feds have been missing in action over the last number of years for obvious reasons. We can't even pass a transportation bill, I'm sorry to say. And FTA is sorry to see it, the way that we've been bumping along at the federal level. But what that means is that local government and local private sector entities are going to have to step up and are stepping up. One of the main ways we're going to pay for transit and all the new bike lanes we have to build is, of course, by raising local taxes. That's primarily taken the place, or the form of raising sales taxes. As you probably know, for transit and bike lanes, the local tax and bond measures that have been passed over the last, or that have been raised over the last 10 years, 72% of them have passed in this anti-tax time. That says the market wants this stuff, and we should not be hesitant to bring tax increases at the local level to the voters for transit and bike lanes. But the other way of paying for it is value capture. This is how, as I mentioned earlier, 1/3 of the rail transit extension out to Tyson's has been paid for. And what value capture is that we know that great urbanism results in tremendous cash flow. otherwise known as gentrification. We need to capture that increased value shown here by the green stripes on this slide. We need to capture a portion of that upside to use to pay off the bonds needed to put in those transportation improvements. And we at LOCUS, our developers, are more than willing to be involved with a value capture mechanism. It's not going to pay for everything. My best guess is that the Tyson's model is pretty much where we're going to be. About a third of the capital costs will be paid for by private sector value capture. So be aware that the feds are not going to bail you out. At best, the feds are going to be there for low interest loans and maybe 20, 30% of the capital. The rest is going to be local, and it's going to be a combination of raising taxes locally and probably value capture. So in the past, walkable urban transit-oriented development used to be a niche market. Now, walkable urban and bikeable urban is the market in this country as we are witnessing the end of sprawl. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That's a great presentation about where the market is going and how important it is to create walkable and bikeable urban areas. So we have about 13 minutes left before it'll be 3 o'clock. So I'll hand it over to Jason Ward from Marta to tell us about their experience with transit-oriented development. And we might not have time for questions, but continue using the questions box to get them to me, and we'll try to report back to you at the end through email if we don't get to them all.
Okay, well, that was a great, can everyone hear me okay? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, good. Want to make
Yes.
sure. Sorry. Thanks, Chris. That was a great presentation. Again, my name is Jason Ward. I'm the manager of joint development at Marta. I'll try to be brief. I also want to quickly recognize Amy Goodwin. She's principal planner and the LCI manager at our MPO, the Atlanta Regional Commission. ARC has been a great partner of ours, and I definitely wanted to recognize Amy and the ARC. So I'm going to briefly go over Marta and our transit-oriented development program. We are the 9th largest transit system in the United States. We essentially move the population of the city of Atlanta proper on a weekday basis, just over 400,000 people. That's split roughly evenly between our buses and rail service. Marta has just over 4,500 employees, and needless to say, we are a major contributor to the regional and state economy here in Georgia. There was a study done in 2012 by the University of Georgia that was able to identify that approximately 7,800 jobs in Fulton and DeKalb counties, which are the 2 key counties, core counties of Metro Atlanta, were directly attributed to Marta, in addition to 24,000 jobs statewide, so over $1.4 billion in economic activity supported annually. I think this is important to note that the Atlanta MSA is 28 counties. It's a very decentralized area, 6 million residents, and there are only 2 counties in that MSA that actually fund the transit, the rail transit that we have. That's Fulton and DeKalb via 1-cent sales tax. And so the 28 county MSA, to give you an idea geographically, is roughly the size of Massachusetts, if you can believe that. So it's, as Chris mentioned earlier, the poster child of sprawl is quite warranted in that regard. We are the largest transit agency in the country that doesn't really receive any dedicated funding from the state. And so as I go into some of these other slides, a lot of the work that we're doing in transit-oriented development is to really help ourselves financially with the amount of resources that we have. Our new general manager came in at the end of 2012, and he announced, Keith Parker, has announced a couple of major transformative initiatives. And a lot of them are centered around generating additional revenue for the authority. And our transit-oriented development program, is one of the main areas in where we're trying to generate additional revenue. So we have three really primary goals for our TOD program. Obviously, the first one is to generate additional transit ridership. Since we haven't expanded our system since the early 2000s, one of the things that we can do is actually bring people closer to the transit by developing underutilized parking lots and things of that nature around our existing rail stations. And the last item there is, to my point, one of our objectives is to generate a return on Marta's transit investment. The way we're set up, if we were to, well, let me back up. So the 1-cent sales tax that's generated from Fulton and DeKalb County, it's basically restricted. 50% of that sales tax has to be used or dedicated to our capital budget, and the remaining 50% goes to our operating and maintenance, our operating budget. So one of the ways that we can help our operating budget is to do transit-oriented type developments where we ground lease the property. We try not to sell it. We want to ground lease it for maybe a 99-year period, for example, and the revenue that's generated from that allows us to help the operating budget. I want to take a quick step back. In 2007, when we were pretty much getting down deep into the recession, Marta took a look at the previous transit-oriented developments that we had. Most of those started in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we really looked at it and reflected and wanted to come up with best practices. So during 2007-2008, we created transit-oriented development guidelines, which are available on our website. And we also created 38 station profiles for all of our rail stations. And the whole point of the TOD guidelines is just that. We knew that real estate is cyclical. We knew that the recession would eventually end. We probably didn't think it would last this long, but we knew it was going to end and development would come back, particularly around our rail stations. So we wanted to make sure that we had a guidelines and policies in place to help internally and that we could manage our resources, but also we wanted a document to serve and to help organizations, developers, and folks outside of the organization to better understand what our objectives are for transit-oriented development. And one of the key elements out of the TOD guidelines is the station access hierarchy, which, as you see there, the priority should be given for development to the pedestrian, followed by bicyclists, and so on down the line versus the automobile. We are in Atlanta. The automobile will always be a part of our lives, but with respect to the guidelines in our future development, we want to minimize the impact of the automobile and how that impacts our developments. And so the TOD guidelines were created in part to identify ways to address that. From the guidelines, our board adopted a series of policies that you see here, specifically in how we address land sales and access to stations. And the third item there, parking in TOD, that's kind of important. Again, it takes a look at how we replace the parking spaces at our stations. For the longest time, Marta, and I even believe Bart and WMATA out in Washington had a one-for-one replacement policy for the development, and that's just not financial feasible. So we are essentially taking this at a case-by-case basis, and we'll focus on existing utilization, and we will only replace those number of spaces that might be utilized over an average of 4 or 5 years versus a one-to-one. Also, in our TOD guidelines, Chapter 4 specifically looks at, like I mentioned, the utilization and replacement of parking spaces, but it also looks at bicycle parking, and we've made it mandatory that all of our new TODs have bicycle parking and bicycle areas for storage within the development. So in addition to our station area, we want to make sure the developments that are built on our property have the facilities in place to facilitate that as well. The local affordable housing advocates here in Atlanta have been very active and very aggressive and really pushing their cause. And I think it's great because I believe we're the only transit agency in the country that has a stated affordable housing goal, and that's 20%. That's also a board-adopted policy. So we don't really define specifically from an area median income basis what that is, but we do that on a case-by-case basis, and that is also one of our key policies and board adopted policies. I'm going to skip ahead here for time. So back in 2013, we announced a major initiative to jumpstart our transit-oriented development program. And back then, we wanted to initiate 5 new TODs within the next 2 years. In this table here, you'll see Brookhaven, King Memorial, Edgewood, Candler Park, and Avondale. All of those have been released. The Brookhaven RFP just went out yesterday, and we're quite excited about that. And then we have several other station areas anticipated for future RFP releases as well. The first RFP that we had released in really over a decade was King Memorial Station. That was in July of 2013. And it's a 4-acre site. It was really an underutilized parking lot just south of our station. We've selected a developer who will be building just under 400 units of multifamily, 15,000 square feet of retail. 20% of those units will be affordable per our policies. And the cool thing is that they are working, there's a really large cemetery right next door. It's actually one of the city's, I believe it is the city's oldest park, and it is actually heavily utilized by joggers and folks who live in the area. It's a great resource, and we're working with them to build a new visitor center to really showcase that park out in front of their gates. And again, we've estimated between 367 and 500 new transit trips on that development. The second RFP that was released at the end of 2013 was for our Avondale station. That's 7.5 acres in the city of Decatur, which is a great little suburb just east of Atlanta. I hate to call it a suburb because it's much more pedestrian friendly and walkable in the traditional sense, but it is technically a suburb. They've proposed 530 multifamily units for rental and 74 condominiums, 24,000 square feet of retail, and again, 20% of those units will also be set aside for affordable and senior housing units. The third one that we released is Edgewood Candler Park, 6-acre site in the city of Atlanta. And one of the key things here that I haven't mentioned yet is a lot of these transit stations, King Memorial, Avondale, and Edgewood Candler Park, they're all located in LCI areas, Livable Centers Initiative, and that's a program from the Atlanta Regional Commission. It's a great program that looks at master planning around most of our stations have been master planned under the program. It brings the community in and sets certain expectations and visions for the area. We've been using the LCI plans and some other master plans as a foundation towards building an RFQ and an RFP release. We want to make sure that the community's had the opportunity to provide some input before we announce that we're ready to release the site for development. And Edgewood Candler Park is another example where we've had a lot of community-based work there. There was a 4-day charrette back in 2011, which followed a couple years of local planning efforts there. The City of Atlanta actually adopted the vision for that site at the end of 2011, and we're currently now working to get that site rezoned prior to obviously the development. So 440 units there. One of the centerpieces is a 2.2-acre park, and again, we have our affordable housing component in that development as well. And the last slide here that I have is for the Brookhaven Oglethorpe station. As I mentioned, we just released that RFP yesterday. The image that you see on the left is just a overall master plan from the original 2006 LCI master plan. In 2007, the DeKalb County Overlay Zoning District was added to bring some teeth to the master plan. As I mentioned to you before, Atlanta, unfortunately, is a very decentralized area. There are new cities created almost annually over the last few years. And in 2012, this area of DeKalb County incorporated and formed the new city of Brookhaven. So we're having new partners come on board, and we're having to work with the new city to basically push the original plan for the development at the Marta station. In 2013, we had a community charrette, in large part because we had a new city and a new form of government in place. And again, we wanted to make sure that everybody was on the same page regarding the future of that station. And again, yesterday we released the RFQ for that site. This is, I think, going to be a great project. The city of Brookhaven is considering moving there or building their new city hall there. I think it's going to have a great civic component, and it's just a really good location, and we're very excited about this particular project. I also want to talk about some what I'd call transit-oriented development, or developments that are not necessarily originating on MARTA property. This is a private development near our Dunwoody station, and State Farm has announced recently that they're going to create 3 regional centers in Phoenix, Dallas, and Atlanta, and they're proposing 2.5 million square feet of office right adjacent to our Dunwoody station. They are paying for the expansion of our station and moving the platform south, and they're going to tie in directly into their office building, which is fantastic from obviously a ridership standpoint. In addition, there's 100,000 square feet of retail, 200 key hotel, and I don't have on the slide, as we're also working with the City of Atlanta and the Atlanta Falcons organization to build a new football facility just west of downtown. I want to talk specifically about pedestrian and bicycle transit access program via the last mile connectivity. We just received a grant, roughly $1 million, and of that allocation, we have $100,000 allocated to bicycle parking. We want to upgrade, really replace a lot of the old furniture that we have at all of our stations. We do have bike racks at all 38 stations, but some of them unfortunately are in really bad shape, and so we want to replace those. We also want to move them, in many cases, behind the fare gates, where it's a little bit more secure and it's obviously covered for our cyclists. We also are looking at a bicycle ramp pilot, and I apologize if I'm using the wrong terminology, but it's I guess you call it the bicycle channel, the curb channel, obviously where you're able to move your bike up the stairwell. So we're looking at that as well. We have $150,000 allocated to that, and pedestrian accessibility improvements and wind shelters as well. With respect to this program, I want to give our local, the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition, and that's Rebecca Cerna. She's the executive director. Rebecca is an amazing person, and she's interacted with us on many different occasions to push and advocate, obviously, on behalf of bicyclists. And this particular program, actually this last mile connectivity and the funding allocation here, I can really point to Rebecca's efforts to make us aware of these issues, and she's done a fantastic job. So I think it's clearly an important piece of making sure that we have access for all modes of transportation. I do want to mention too that all of our bus fleet, 100% of our bus fleet is accessible for bicycles. We have bike racks available on all of our buses, and so we want to continue that expansion as well. So I want to cut that off because I know we're running out of time, but that's pretty much the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Jason. That's a great presentation. Great to hear about the work of the Atlanta Bicycle Coalition, how you are working together with them. Yeah, we're a little over 3 right now, so unfortunately there won't be time for questions, but thank you, Joanne and Chris and Jason and Amy, even though we didn't have time to get to you and get some good questions for your great presentations. And just please, attendees, go read our report and give us your feedback on it. We really think there's a lot that bicycle and pedestrian advocates can do to promote transit and work with transit agencies and make these built environments better for everyone who wants to access transit and use transit to get around their communities. So thank you all for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you.